Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Fickle Groom. Chapter 1. The day that Martha Sinclair left her hometown of Harkinson, Virginia, for good was the most frightening day of her life. She said as much to the young girl beside her, but Lissa only laughed. "What's frightening about it?" she cried. "This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened to either of us, Martha, and you know it." Martha sighed. "Things can be exciting and frightening at the same time, Lissa." But her cousin wasn't listening to her. She was craning her neck to try and see if the wagon at the front of the train was moving yet. They were 4 wagons back, 4th out of 12. The more the merrier, their driver, John, had told them cheerfully, but Martha knew the real reason for the high numbers, the tight formation of the wagons, sticking close together. The road west was rife with dangers, bandits, outlaws, Indians, wild animals and wilder humans. It was foolish of her to strike out on her own, and even more foolish to take Lissa with her. But what choice had she? Everything she had ever cherished in Harkinson was gone. She had nothing left to her name after her Aunt Shirley passed away, leaving only debt in her wake. Debt, and poor Lissa. The girl was only 9 years old, and the death of her single remaining parent hit her hard. It would have hit her harder, Martha knew, had she not already been treating Martha like a second mother rather than a cousin. Was it possible that truly only 3 months had passed since that wintry day when they had buried Shirley in the little cemetery beside the Harkinson chapel? It felt like it had been no time at all, and yet so many of the individual days had crawled by. How strange to think that it was only just shy of 80 days, now, since she had made that fateful trip to the nearby town of Winchester. Winchester was 3 times the size of Harkinson and boasted several amenities that her hometown did not. Among them was a matrimonial agency. From then on, events became rather muddled in her mind. She knew that she had undergone 2 interviews regarding her situation, station in life, obligations, wealth or lack thereof, and reason for wanting to be married before the agent had found her a suitable match. About her personal traits or her dreams, or what she looked for in a potential husband, she had not been asked. Not that she minded. Her own desires were far from important. All that mattered were that she be able to pay the debts left behind by Shirley and care for Lissa. And so, they were off, heading west more than 1,000 miles to the Idaho Territories, to meet a man named Thomas Wheeler. Meet and marry. Martha Sinclair was a mail-order bride. The 12 wagons of the train were filled to the brim with travelers. Martha and Lissa were far from the only women, though most of the others traveled along with their husbands, fathers, or brothers. Martha thought that it ought to have felt odd, to stand out so among the rest. But the truth was that she'd never had a male protector. Her father had died when she was young. She'd had no brothers. And Lissa's father, God rest his soul, had been anything but protective. If anything, Shirley had had to protect and care for him, a fact which was hammered home when he succumbed to an illness on the first and only time he traveled without his doting wife by his side. She had been forced to stay at home during her seclusion, heavily pregnant with Lissa, when George was instructed by his employer to retrieve a package from a town 30 miles away. The sudden squall of rain had come as a surprise. George's swift demise had been less so. No, men were almost more trouble than they were worth, in Martha's opinion. She was not particularly looking forward to being married. It was a matter of necessity, nothing more than that. She and Lissa needed a roof over their heads and food on the table. In a town like Harkinson, it was impossible for Martha to earn enough to provide what they needed. And, though she was loath to admit it, Shirley's illness and the debt it had incurred had shaped how she and Lissa were viewed. The only pride she could hold on to was the fact that she had managed to pay it all off before they left, by selling everything they owned. Leaving Harkinson behind was the right thing to do, she was certain of it, even if it was the most difficult. It took a few days for her to get to know her fellow travelers. The first day, she gave a tentative smile to the elderly man across from her. Along with the driver, he was the only other person in their little wagon, number 4, and she couldn't help but be curious as to why he was traveling alone, and why the organizer of the train should have put him, a lone male, with a young woman and a girl. She was relieved when he smiled back, though the smile quickly turned into a wince when the wagon went over an unexpected rut in the ground. "Oh, dear, are you all right?" The words came out before she could consider them. Moved by his obvious pain, she reached out, only stopping short just shy of brushing his sleeve with her fingertips. He nodded, but the pained expression remained. "Fine, just fine, my dear. Old war wound, I guess you'd say." He nodded to his leg, which was extended rather stiffly out in front of him. "A war wound?" Lissa asked, eyes wide. "May I see?" "Lissa," Martha scolded, but the old fellow chuckled. "I'm not sure it's a sight for young eyes." "Oh, I've seen lots of things that would frighten other people," Lissa said confidently. "I've seen snakes, and big spiders, and a crab, and my mother, too, after she was dead." Convulsively, Martha reached out to draw her cousin towards her, anxious to stop her from her rash speech, but Lissa simply turned an innocent, wide-eyed expression on her and she sighed and shook her head. "I wish I could find a way to control her," she lamented, "but as of yet, I've failed." The old soldier gave her a sympathetic smile. "Young ones are like that," he said. "I ought to know, I suppose." "Do you have a daughter?" Lissa asked eagerly. "Like me?" "I did once." "What happened to her?" He smiled again, fondly this time. "She grew up to be the strongest, finest, prettiest woman in all the world," he said. "I'm headed out west to spend my twilight years admiring her, or rather, to be whipped into shape by her." Another chuckle. "She married a lawyer who decided his calling lay in defending criminals in the courts of the Wild West. Too many innocents gettin' hanged," he said, and hauled her off to California." He glanced at Martha. "But maybe I oughtn't to talk like that." "It's all right," Lissa said. "I know what hanging is." "Don't tell me you've seen that, too." Lissa shook her head. "No, but only because Martha wouldn't let me." Martha sighed in exasperation. "I'm sorry, sir. My young cousin does have a rather morbid sense of curiosity. That's nothing to apologize for. I reckon it'll see her through a great deal of trouble, in the end." He thought for a moment and then reached down to pull up the bottom of his trousers. The sight displayed was nothing more than an ankle, rippled across with white twists of scar tissue, but it was enough to impress Lissa, for a moment, at least. As the young girl moved to the back of the wagon to wave to the driver behind them, the old soldier nodded again at Martha. "Did she mean what she said? About her mother?" Martha nodded back, once. "Yes. It was a tragedy for her to lose her mother so early in life. She'd be about 9, 10 years old?" "9, yes." The old soldier nodded to himself. "My girl was about that age when we lost her mother," he said. 12, I think. I reckon you've been a mother to her, since she lost hers." "I've done my best." Strange, how emotion seemed to clutch at her throat in the most unexpected moments. She turned her head away from the intensity of his gaze. He gave a gruff smile. "Don't reckon anyone could do it better." His compliment was meaningless, she knew. He didn't know her, after all. They were perfect strangers. But there was honesty in his tone, and in his pale blue eyes. "I'm Jim," he said, proffering a hand to her. "Jim Buford. I'm going to California." She hesitated, but only a moment, before she took his hand. "Martha Sinclair, and that's my cousin Melissa Roper." "Lissa." "We are going." Why were the words so difficult to say? They sounded foreign to her tongue. "We are going to Fielder's Mill, in the Idaho Territories." "Uh-huh." He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "You've got family there?" Martha swallowed hard, thinking of the engagement that awaited her. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." Chapter 2. Jim Buford was far from the only friend that Martha made along the journey west, but Lissa was the true catalyst to each conversation. The girl simply would not stay put, no matter how many times her older cousin begged her to stay where she could keep an eye on her. Every evening, the wagon trains circled up, with cooking fires in the clearing in the middle, and every evening, as soon as Martha bent her head to the task of preparing supper, Lissa was off and running, sometimes literally. She had boundless energy, especially after being cooped up in the wagon throughout the day. Again and again, Martha left a pot of soup or stew bubbling over the fire and went to look for her. Somehow, no matter how many times it happened, she always felt the icy hand of fear clutching at her throat with those first moments of realizing that Lissa was not where she'd left her. The responsibility of rearing her cousin was heavier on her shoulders here in the wilderness than it had ever been in Harkinson, but then, there were far more dangers to be afraid of. And no matter how clearly she tried to explain it to Lissa, the girl never quite seemed to understand that the wide, wonderful world could be a threatening and frightful place just as easily as it could be friendly and beautiful. Still, it was through Lissa's determined mischief that Martha found herself getting to know those around her. Wagon number 5 held the Smith family. A father and mother, 3 little girls whom Lissa befriended at once, and a son, 20 years old, but pale and small, undeniably sickly. Martha's heart went out to him from the moment they shook hands, but even more to his mother. Caroline Smith held her youngest daughter in her arms, but her eyes were fixed on her oldest, and they seemed sad and haunted. Scarcely a week had passed before Martha found out the source of Caroline's dread. She feared that Colin might not survive the hard trip west, and knew that if he should die, she would not be able to bring his body with her. He would be buried on the prairie in the wilderness, and they would have no choice but to leave him behind. Wagon number 2 carried Vera and Alma, 2 sisters, both unmarried, one widowed. It was unusual for unmarried women to travel west, they cheerfully informed Martha, and thus they ought to form a sort of club to look out for each other. They were going all the way to California, to live with their elderly uncle, who was a prospector. He'd written them the previous year that he had struck gold, and they were to inherit, as his only remaining family. Privately, the older sister Alma whispered to Martha that she feared the letter was a ruse. Their uncle had never been particularly fond of them, and it was very strange to receive such a missive. But whom might it have come from? She wasn't sure, but surely it could not be well-intentioned. She held back from telling Vera of her suspicions because she was so very excited about it all. Wagon number 7 carried an assortment of fellows, a preacher who had a nervous habit of adjusting his dog collar when he was called upon to speak, an out-of-work cowboy who had been dismissed from his former employment due to his fear of bulls, a young man who had hard eyes and never spoke, an older man who spoke at length of his hope to hold political office, and a widower with spiteful eyes. Martha did not care for any of them, except the cowboy. He took up the habit of coming to her cooking fire each evening, and she rewarded his attentions with a bowl of whatever she was preparing, appreciative of his apparent friendliness. It was good to feel that she and Lissa had a protector. On the 5th day, he tried to kiss her, and she was forced to inform him with frost in her voice that she was engaged to be married. He did not return to her fire after that. It was a hard road, to be sure, and the further west they went, the more certain Martha was that she would have to become hard herself if she wanted to survive it and protect Lissa along the way. It made her a little heartsick to think of it, but in truth, she had already become harder than she used to be. The day she had agreed to marry a man she had never met, the iron had entered her soul. It was a poetic expression she had heard before, and she'd never known what it meant. She knew now. Still, it did no good to allow herself to be crushed. She still had Lissa, running and laughing and endlessly curious, and somewhere out there, waiting in the wildness of the unknown, she had a home and a husband waiting for her. Jim was an agreeable companion in the wagon, and though the days passed slowly, she was grateful to have someone to talk to. 2 weeks into the journey, though, they rolled to a stop just outside of a town in western Nebraska, and he gave her a smile that was filled with finality. "Well, Miss Martha, I reckon this is goodbye." Dismayed, she stared at him with wide eyes. "Goodbye. But I thought you were going all the way to California." "That I am, but southerly, not the northern route we've been talking. My girl will be waitin' for me far too long if I continue along this way." "Oh, But, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. It wasn't until that moment that she realized how much she had come to rely upon the comfort of his presence. He seemed to understand her thoughts even without being spoken. He gave a warm chuckle. "Now, don't you worry about a thing, Miss Martha. You've made yourself a friend to everyone in this wagon train, I guess, and no one more than me. You'll be just fine." He gathered up his pack and glanced back at her, hesitating for a moment. "Miss Martha, you never did tell me who's waitin' for you on the other end of the line." She took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage, and managed to give him a brave smile. "That's right, I didn't," she said. "I suppose it's because I don't rightly know. He's a stranger to me. But he holds my future, and Lissa's, in his hands." Jim Buford nodded slowly. "A mail-order bride," he said. "I reckoned as much. Well, Miss Martha, I'll give you this piece of advice. A bit of a parting gift, for all your sweetness and kindness." He paused, holding her gaze. "Don't settle for any less than happiness," the old soldier said softly. "The way you care for others, especially little Melissa, you deserve all the happiness you can find." His tone was so intense, so full of truth and meaning, that Martha felt a little thrill run through her. She had not realized until then how much weight the old fellow's regard carried with her. She couldn't help but smile, and it did not take so much courage this time. "But, Mr. Buford, I haven't any say over whether I'm happy or not." "Poppycock," said Jim Buford. "You've got all the say and more. Don't go givin' that to anyone else." "But I gave my word that I'd marry this man," she said, trying to explain. He laid a finger against his nose knowingly. "Words have been broken before," he said. "Better words be broken than hearts." Long after he left the wagon train, long after the train itself left the town behind, she thought over what he had told her. Better words be broken than hearts. But if she broke her word, what honor would she have left? Would she be able to live with herself? Then again, suppose Thomas Wheeler truly was not the man the matrimonial agency represented him to be. Suppose he was cruel, not just to Martha but to Lissa. She could bear anything on her own part, she thought, but she could not allow anyone to damage her cousin. Poor Lissa had been through far too much as it was. Don't settle for any less than happiness. You deserve all the happiness you can find. Well, she told herself with a sigh, there was no use trying to cross bridges before you reached them. She couldn't look for happiness until she arrived in Fielder's Mill. Even then, it would be far more practical to simply expect what was more likely, a husband who had promised to care for her needs and those of her cousin. Happiness seemed like little more than a foolish daydream. In the wake of Jim Buford's departure, the road west seemed strangely quiet for a time. Their driver, a saturnine fellow named Blake, never seemed inclined to conversation, no matter how many overtures she ventured. The saving grace, she found, was in the way the rosters changed. As they traveled further into the wildness, each town became a stopping point for some, a starting point for others. They traded the preacher for a young couple, just married and eager to seek their fortune in the lands west of civilization. At the edge of Wyoming Territory, the cowboy left without saying goodbye. Martha felt a stab of regret when she realized that he was no longer among the group, though she did not care to analyze it. Perhaps it was just that momentary lure of romance with a man who smiled at her so sweetly. What would her life be like, if she had let him kiss her? Yes, best not to think on it too deeply. Her destiny lay further ahead. Their journey was ending, and for the most part they had avoided the dangers that had seemed so fraught at the beginning. Rumors of banditry ran like a wind from south to east, spurring them on at their back, but none of the masked rascals came near to the train. The most frightening thing was at night in the vast stillness, listening to the wolves and the coyotes howl in the distance. Then, and only then, Lissa would show a hint of fear despite her habitual bravery, clutching close to Martha. Martha would put her arms around her young cousin and hold her tightly. She knew the howling of the wild creatures was frightening, but she wouldn't have traded anything for the stark and vivid beauty of the upturned bowl of the skies, and the way the stars glittered. Only a few days out from Fielder's Mill, they stopped briefly at a larger town, the largest in the western section of Idaho Territory. While the mules and horses were watered, Martha took Lissa by the hand and explored the little settlement. They had scarcely gone more than a few feet before Lissa leapt with excitement, snatching her hand from her cousin's. "Look, Martha. Look at that little girl on the horse." Martha looked. It was impossible not to. Standing beside a large, whitewashed building, the horse was enormous, by far one of the largest she had ever seen. She felt her spirit quail at the very sight of it. The thick black coat shone in the sun, and there was an undeniably intelligent glint in the black eyes. Atop the magnificent beast was a girl who could not have been more than a year or two older than Lissa herself, but she was so dwarfed by her steed that she appeared to be little more than a toddler. Every maternal instinct Martha had ever felt rose up in her throat, and she hurried towards the horse, both to prevent Lissa from getting too close to it and to rescue the other girl, though she did not appear in need of rescuing. In fact, she looked downright at ease, leaning forward to stroke the horse's mane, a smile on her impish face. "Melissa, come back to my side at once." Martha did not employ that tone of voice very often. Overuse, she suspected, would render it powerless. But on this occasion, Lissa jumped with startlement and obeyed. Clutching her cousin's hand, Martha came cautiously closer towards the giant horse, eyeing the girl atop it with worry. The girl looked back down at her without the slightest hint of concern. "Hello," she said, chiefly to Lissa. Lissa's face was full of admiration, for the horse and its rider both. She had to tilt her head straight back to look up at her. "How did you get up there?" "Climbed, of course," said the other girl with a laugh. It was only now that Martha realized the horse was hitched up to a wagon. It was not a covered wagon, like number 4, and it was only about half the size of the smallest wagon in the train. The back of it was full to the brim with boxes, a load that would have been an insurmountable weight for most horses alone. By rights, she supposed, there ought to have been at least 2 of the creatures in the traces. But then, this horse seemed to be unique. Likely he could pull the load without even noticing it. "This is Lissa," she said, keeping her voice calm, "and I'm Martha." "I'm Susan," said the girl, with a broad smile. "Susan Thornton. We're very pleased to make your acquaintance, Susan. But don't you think you'd better come down from there? If that horse becomes startled, he might throw you." "Oh, Jack doesn't get startled," Susan said knowledgeably. She patted the horse's glossy neck. "He's steady as a rock, Pa says." Martha's lips tightened. Where was the girl's father, who was so full of praise for the horse's reliability? He ought to have been out there, keeping an eye on his daughter. Before she could pose the question in a more polite manner, the door nearby swung wide, disgorging 2 men, both talking animatedly over each other as though in competition that could only be won by refusing to pause for breath. "And if you think you'll find a better price somewhere else, you're welcome to go and look." "I know I could, Robinson, that ain't the point. You and me had a deal. Times are tough all over." "I've half a mind to make 'em a bit tougher on you," growled the second man. He stopped suddenly, spotting Martha, and frowned. "Hey there, what are you doing to my horse and cart?" Martha gulped and took Lissa's hand a little more tightly in hers. Lissa did not seem to be as frightened by the strange man as Martha felt, and immediately set to tugging at her hand to try and get free. But Martha's attention was entirely focused on the man, who was even now striding forward towards her, brow furrowed. He was very tall, well over 6 feet, with the broadest shoulders she had ever seen. His frame was large and muscular, clear proof of a life spent working hard. He wore trousers with patches at the knees, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled up to his elbows. He looked as though he were about to bend his considerable strength to a task, and she herself was the task in question. Somehow, she found her voice. "I'm not doing anything to your horse and cart," she said. "I was speaking with the child, Susan Thornton." He scowled at her. "How do you know her name?" About to retort that Susan had introduced herself in a friendly way, as polite people tended to do, Martha paused. The certainty washed over her, and her heart sank. "You must be her father, Mr. Thornton." He stopped at last, a mere 2 feet from her. His physical presence had such an aura that it felt as though he were touching her when he lifted his arms and folded them. "Don't tell me you're one of them fortune tellers," he said rudely. Martha felt a hot flush wash over her. "No, I am not," she said staunchly. "What do you mean by letting your little girl climb up on a horse like that, Mr. Thornton?" Why, the slightest startle and she could break an arm or a leg just falling from his back. "Oh, ho, you're not a fortune teller, you're just a busybody. Listen here, young miss, that horse would carry an entire tea service on his back without spilling a drop, if I asked him to. But I reckon you don't know the first thing about horses." "I may not know about horses, but I know about children. It's dangerous to leave her up there like that." In the distance, she heard the call of wagon number 1's driver. It was time to return, the train would be leaving soon. Gulping, she turned to look over her shoulder, and that movement was all it took to inform Thornton of what he wanted to know. "So, you're from back east, then," he said, brow clearing a little. "That explains it. There's nothing like an Easterner for sticking her nose in where it don't belong. Listen, young miss, you'd better get on back to the wagon train. Never know when the bandits'll come around." He nodded at Lissa. "You've got to protect your daughter there, after all. Talk about dangerous." Martha darted a swift glance at Lissa, just in time to see her flinch. She put an arm around her and drew her close. "I'd thank you for your concern, if I thought it was honestly meant," she said. "Mine was, however. I'm sorry if I offended you, Mr. Thornton. I suppose you must know best. But I would have been remiss not to speak up, when I saw a child that may have been in danger." She could still hear the steel in her tone, she was fairly vibrating with it, so there was no hiding her irritation completely. But her careful self-control won out in the end, and her words were polite and well-considered enough to bring a reluctant calm to the man's face. His eyes were very dark, she saw, as dark as those of his horse, with a similar light in them. His hair was thick and black and wavy. He raised a hand to the girl on the horse, and she tossed a hat down to him. "What are we doing now, Pa?" Instead of answering her directly, he turned back to Martha. "I'll take your words as intended, young miss. It's not everyone I'd give that consideration to. But I figure you need all the help you can get. From the look of you, I'd reckon you have something of a habit of biting off more than you can chew." She stepped back from him, turning away in distaste, and caught just the edge of a grin from him as she went. There was something appealing, attractive even, in his features, even in his rough-hewn way, though she disliked his assessment of her. It wasn't in the least bit true, was it? Was it? She took Lissa's hand more tightly in hers and hurried toward the waiting wagon train. Behind her, she heard the girl's voice drift on the wind. "Well, Pa." Susan's voice was a chirp. Daniel Thornton grinned up at her. "What do you say to ridin' with a wagon train?" he said. "The one that little girl is in?" He nodded. "That's the only one around, I reckon." Susan hooped and clapped her hands. Beneath her, Jack took one small step sideways, turning his head to look at his master. Thornton stroked his nose and glanced back towards the mercantile. Adam Robinson had returned inside, likely grateful of the chance to escape Thornton's irritation, however justified it might be. And justified it was. The two had had an agreement when Thornton bought the goods from Robinson to sell in his little store in Fielder's Mill. What didn't sell could be returned for the cost of the original sale. But when it came down to it, Robinson had refused to give him what he had promised and instead undercut him badly. He'd refused, of course, but Robinson had stood firm. And now Daniel Thornton had a whole wagon load of goods that he could not sell with any reliability. Times were tight as they were, he'd been counting on that money. He sighed and rubbed at his eyes with his fingertips. No use in crying over spilt milk. And for sure no use in opening himself up to the bandits that were roaming the territories. He had brought the wagon load here on his own, risking the quick journey east with no more protection than his own rifle. He was not inclined to do so again. Chapter 3. The wagon train would offer him the protection he needed, for his daughter's sake, if nothing else. And it would provide something else, too, he thought with an unconscious smile, turning his sights in the direction of the train company. Now that the journey was nearly over, the last few days of travel seemed to tumble forward in a rush to be over and done with. Martha found herself struck with a strange feeling of nostalgia. The future loomed immediately ahead of her, huge and unknown. All the lure of the possible was passing her by with every turn of the wheels, and soon she would find out the truth, about the town she had agreed to come to, the man she had agreed to marry, and the home that waited for her. Soon, there would be no more maybes. And so, the final miles of the long trip west were imbued with a rosy sort of glow, the starry nights of mid-spring still chilly with the lingering cold of winter, the sunrises each morning burning on the edge of the horizon. The beauty of the world around her made her throat ache, and she fought the urge to cling to her fellow travelers as though they themselves were her saviors. The lone exception to this, of course, was Mr. Thornton. It had made her heart sink to realize that he and his daughter were joining the wagon train. Even more so when she overheard his destination, Fielder's Mill. In vain she tried to tell herself that there was no reason for the two of them to cross paths once they arrived. In all likelihood, she knew, the town was too small to avoid it. Besides, as she found out from another passenger in wagon number 8, Mr. Daniel Thornton was a merchant. He ran a small mercantile in Fielder's Mill, the only general store for miles around. It would be impossible to avoid him entirely. In truth, she knew that she ought to make things up with him. Even if not for her own sake, then for the sake of Lissa. On the first day that the small merchant's wagon joined the tail end of the train, hardly an hour had passed before the flap of number 4 opened and Susan Thornton tumbled in, breathless from running to catch up. She had greeted both Martha and Lissa with an enthusiastic grin, stretched wide across her impish face. "How did you get here?" Lissa asked, wide-eyed and staring in awe. Susan had laughed. "I climbed, of course." From that moment, the friendship between the two girls was cemented by a mixture of Lissa's admiration and Susan's loneliness. It was clear that the older girl, she announced to Martha, without being asked, that she was 11 years old, was longing for the companionship of someone her own age. For Lissa, too, the meeting was a blessing. The three Smith girls were too young to fill the need she had for a good friend, and besides, they were soon to part ways with the Smiths and everyone else on the wagon train. Their destination was at hand. Yes, for the sake of Lissa and Susan, Martha knew that she ought to mend fences with Daniel Thornton, whether he wanted to do so or not. Gritting her teeth and squaring her shoulders, she set out to do just that on the final evening before they arrived in Fielder's Mill. The Thorntons had set up a little square of canvas, scarcely enough to warrant the term tent, creating a lean-to against the side of the wagon. After all, Martha reflected, the wagon itself would have been difficult to sleep in, what with all the boxes it still carried as cargo. And it was not covered, besides. Still, the small stretch of canvas hardly appeared large enough to cover the two. She was allowing herself to become distracted from her purpose. Though it took all her courage, she advanced on the broad-shouldered frame of Daniel Thornton. Poised over the cooking fire, stirring the contents of a pot with a large spoon, he looked almost comically out of place. Almost, she thought, gulping at the knot of nerves in her throat. She wondered suddenly where his wife was, perhaps waiting for him, back at home. Mr. Thornton. He glanced up, one eyebrow raising as a small, wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Young miss. What am I doing wrong now, eh?" She pressed her lips together but would not let him deter her from her goal. "Nothing at all, Mr. Thornton. I only thought, perhaps we ought to meet. Officially." He sat back on his haunches. "Why?" Well, it would be more polite, don't you think?" This earned a laugh from him, even as he shook his head. "You sure are an Easterner, aren't you, young miss? Folks don't worry too much about bein' polite out here in the Territories." His smile gleamed teasingly. "But maybe our idea of polite ain't the same as yours. Tellin' a man what he can and can't do about his own daughter, for example." She flinched at this. "Are you deliberately making it difficult on me?" she asked him quietly. "I only want to make peace with you, for the sake of Lissa and Susan." Strangely enough, this seemed to catch at his better instincts. He looked at her a moment longer. It occurred to her that though he was seated and she stood as tall as she could, he was still nearly her own height. He scarcely had to look up at her at all. And when he stood, as he did suddenly in one swift movement, she had to stop herself from taking a step back, so toweringly did he loom. He was not more than 2 feet away from her, and again she felt that strange brushing against her, as though he had touched her, though he did not. He took off his hat and tossed it onto a nearby rock. "You're right, young miss," he said. "And you'll find one thing out about me: when someone's right, I own it." He grinned. "Course, when I'm right myself, I don't let 'em forget that, either. But in this case, for the sake of my little girl, and yours, I reckon we ought to try and be civil." He held out a hand to her. Biting her lip, she took it, and felt her fingers enfolded in the broad, calloused warmth of his palm. "I think we can be friends," she offered, hesitantly, and this earned another laugh. "Let's not get carried away, young miss." Slightly stung by this evident rejection of her more friendly overtures, though only offered out of politeness, she pulled her hand from his and tucked her hands behind her back. "You might start being civil by calling me something other than young miss," she snapped. "Why, I don't believe you're all that much older than I am." "Oh? And how old's that?" It was, of course, the height of rudeness to ask a woman her age, but strangely enough, she didn't believe that he meant it that way. It was the first thing he'd said that did not seem calculated to offend. 24, she confessed at last. "And I'm 31. So, I'm 7 years your elder, even if not your better. You might have reckoned, I guess, by Susie's age. Lord knows she likes to tell all and sundry every detail." He chuckled. "You're a mite younger than I thought, though, considerin' little Lissa." His meaning settled over her like a cloud, and she blushed heartily. "Oh, Lissa is my cousin," she corrected him swiftly. 9 years old. "I suppose that's why she and your Susan are getting along so well. They're far enough apart that they won't be rivals, and near enough that they understand each other." "I guess they'll be the friends, then," Thornton said with a grave nod. "And you and I'll just be civil." She hesitated, and then gave him a nod, feeling as though at least any outright animosity was settled. She turned to go, and he called her back. "Might I have the privilege of knowin' your name, young miss?" Blushing once more, she turned back. "Martha," she said. "Martha Sinclair." The merchant was squatted on his haunches once more, moving with a leonine grace as he stirred the pot. He nodded and glanced up at her. "Daniel Thornton," he said, and smiled. It was a genuine smile this time, not that teasing and provocative grin. He really was quite handsome, she thought, and shocked herself. "Reckon you might as well call me Daniel, seein' as we're bein' so civil. And you may call me Martha." Had she really said it? She'd had no intentions of doing so. There was something about his very presence that seemed to overwhelm her, bringing forth thoughts and words that she never intended. "I expect you'll be glad to be home again in Fielder's Mill, tomorrow." It was on the tip of her tongue to inquire whether his wife was eagerly anticipating him, but something held her back. The more she spoke with Daniel Thornton, the more she suspected that he was not married at all. What, then, had happened to Susan's mother? But she couldn't ask, of course. They were not friends. They were barely even acquaintances. His eyes were on the fire again, and she saw the flames reflected, dancing, in them. "Home again," he said, so softly that she wasn't sure she heard the words. There was no eagerness in his tone, only a strange sort of resignation. But perhaps he was disgruntled because of not being able to sell his cargo, she thought. She'd heard a few rumors about that, too. At any rate, there was no point in dwelling on Daniel Thornton. She would see him now and again in town, and of course Lissa would undoubtedly want to play with Susan whenever she could. But apart from that, they need have no interactions. Perhaps she could even ask her new husband, Thomas Wheeler, to fetch what she needed from the mercantile. Then she need never see Daniel Thornton at all. The wagon train rolled into the little town of Fielder's Mill, Idaho, in the middle of the afternoon of June the 1st. Despite her nervousness about the future that was so near at hand, Martha could not pretend that she would regret never setting foot in a covered wagon again, and she would especially, she told herself, not miss sleeping in one. The straw mattress that she had shared with Lissa had gradually accumulated so many ants and other bugs that it felt as though they were sleeping on the ground. The matting had grown flattened and lumpy in places as they rattled over the rough roads, and her back felt every flaw. Yes, a feather mattress would not go amiss, and as though the thought had unleashed a portion of her mind that she had kept closed, she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of other civilized amenities she had been missing. A real bath, with hot water. Clean clothing. A blanket that did not smell of mule. A proper stove, not a simple cooking fire. All of it waited in front of her, and she drew Lissa into her arms in a spontaneous embrace as they watched wagon number 4 roll on its way westward. Number 5, following along behind, lifted the flap, and the Smith girls waved a solemn farewell to Lissa. Martha took in a deep breath and squeezed her eyes shut, sending a brief prayer heavenward for the Smiths, for Vera and Alma, for Jim Buford, for everyone else she had met along the journey west, a prayer for safety, for health, for joy. Don't settle for any less than happiness. You deserve all the happiness you can find. With another deep breath, she sent up a final prayer, this one for Lissa and for herself. Thomas Wheeler, as the matrimonial agency had informed her, was a tailor. The only tailor in Fielder's Mill, which was hardly surprising. In fact, the only real surprise was that the town was large enough to merit a tailor at all. From where she stood along the main road, the town appeared to be nothing but a small group of buildings, haphazardly clustered around each other. She spotted the tail end of the merchant's wagon disappearing around the corner of one of the larger buildings. Sure enough, the sign above read Thornton's General Store. After a moment, Susan came running around the corner, hopping with delight as she waited for her father to unlock the doors. Daniel Thornton followed in her wake, more sedately. As he let her inside, he turned to glance over his shoulder, his gaze finding Martha as though he'd been looking for her. She gave him a smile, a tentative wave. But she received no smile, no wave in return. Just a jerk of his chin, hardly even a nod of recognition, before he disappeared into the depths of the store. She sighed but determinately put Daniel Thornton out of her mind. It was no use following him to inquire about where she might find Thomas Wheeler. She smiled down at Lissa, who was looking rather tired after all the excitement of their arrival, and swung their joined hands. "Come on," she said. "Look for a sign that says tailor." Leaving their trunks where they were for the moment, they set out on their search. It was far from daunting. Every business seemed to have a sign, either hanging from the eaves or leaning against the wall out front, and there were few enough of them. The tailor seemed to be rather difficult to find, despite this helpfulness. It was Lissa who spotted the sign at last, half fallen from its pinnings on the outside of a small building that looked more like a cabin than a place of business. "There it is, Martha." Martha took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, searching deep within for the courage she so desperately needed. She took Lissa's hand more firmly in hers. "Very well," she said, trying not to look at the rather shabby yard and the peeling whitewash. "Let's go and knock." Chapter 4. Thomas Wheeler was far from what Martha had been promised, and even further from what she had imagined. He was 45 if he was a day. To begin with, a large bald spot shone through his sparse, reddish-gray hair. He wore spectacles and a squint-eyed expression that suggested they were not doing their job as expected. He also wore a smile, when he laid eyes on Martha, a smile that devolved swiftly into a frown as soon as he saw Lissa. "I hate to bring it up," he muttered, though his tone did not agree, "but I was under the impression that you were not a widow." Martha blinked at him. They had only met a few moments before. She had not yet been invited inside but stood on the veranda. Lissa, bored with the conversation, which was admittedly stilted, had gone off to explore. "And you are correct. I'm not." He twisted his mouth unpleasantly. "The girl. My cousin. Surely the matrimonial agency mentioned her." "Ah," he said, waving a hand. In passing. In passing. I don't believe they said anything about the girl traveling with you." There was something about his demeanor, and his manner, and his voice, and his face, that she did not like. She felt her back begin to stiffen and lifted her chin. "She is not just traveling with me," she said. "She is my ward. I'm her guardian, we are each other's only family, and I care for her as though she were my own daughter." Thomas Wheeler shook his head. "That's what I was afraid of," he said. "Miss Sinclair, I cannot and will not bring a child under this roof. Not when she ain't mine." Martha gaped at him. Her stomach felt as though it were plummeting off the top of a 5-story building. Would it ever land? She felt rather dizzy. "I beg your pardon?" "You can stay. We have an agreement." "It ain't in my best interest, I see that now." "But the girl?" He shook his head again. Martha took a step backwards, just enough to lean against the column that was, just barely, holding up the roof of the porch. "You can't mean it." "I never say things I don't mean, Miss Sinclair. Wouldn't get too far in a town like Fielder's Mill otherwise. Folks around here pride themselves on their honesty. Not like some back east, I reckon." This got her back up, and she stood up straight, her spirit returning. "I suppose by that you mean to imply that I've been lying to you somehow, or concealing something. I've never made any bones about the fact that Lissa is in my charge. It was after the death of her mother that I found myself forced to apply to the matrimonial agency to begin with. Surely you don't imagine that I would choose to marry a stranger otherwise." She hadn't truly intended to, but her words clearly stung him, perceived as a personal insult. He stepped back over the threshold into his little house. "That's between you and your conscience, I reckon," he growled. "But the fact remains that I've no intention of payin' foreign providin' for the upbringing of some little runt who looks so hungry she'd eat me out of house and home if I so much as turned my back. I fancied havin' a wife who could help with the business, and you look capable enough. But if you're that dead set on the girl—" "I certainly am." "Then I reckon our agreement is at an end. Goodbye, Miss Sinclair." The door closed, with an air of finality. For a moment she stood in utter disbelief, staring at it. Her fist clenched at her side, she fought the urge to step up to the door and hammer on it until he came back out and allowed her to hammer on him instead. But a moment of holding her breath and reflecting cleared all thoughts of retaliation from her head. Instead, she thought once more of the future. Thomas Wheeler had held all the keys, a place to live, food on the table, clothes on their backs. She had placed all her trust in the arrangement they had come to. And now that arrangement was gone, and she was stranded in a town she did not know, without a roof over her head or any way of providing for herself, or for Lissa. And Lissa was stranded right along with her. Numbly, she made her way back off the porch. Lissa responded to her rather strangled call and came bouncing around the corner, ready for whatever came next. One look at her older cousin's drawn face told her that something was wrong. With uncharacteristic restraint, she did not ask what had happened but took Martha's hand in hers and walked alongside her as they left the tailor's house behind. Martha felt tears choking her throat, and she fought them down. "Lissa," she managed. "I'm afraid that, things with Mr. Wheeler, didn't quite work out as we had planned. I will not be marrying him." Lissa was quiet for a moment and then heaved a sigh of relief. "Good," she said candidly. "I didn't like him. He's too ugly to be your husband, Martha, you're too much prettier than him. Don't you think a husband and a wife ought to both be pretty?" Martha choked on the urge to laugh. "In a perfect world, perhaps," she allowed, too tired to try and correct the girl's thinking on the subject. What did it matter, anyhow? There was no use in trying to defend Thomas Wheeler. His actions were indefensible. As soon as she got the chance, she would find a writing desk and sit down and send a long, detailed letter of complaint to the matrimonial agency. But perhaps she ought to find a roof and supper before she got ahead of herself. They made their way back to where they had started, where their trunks still waited. No one had touched them, if nothing else, the people of Fielder's Mill were evidently honest. But what was she to do next? Seating herself on the trunk, with Lissa leaning against her, she took stock of the situation, such as it was. Then the door of the building across the street opened, and Susan Thornton spilled out. With a joyful shout, she ran towards Lissa, who leapt to her feet, all evidence of tiredness disappearing, and raced in her direction. They met with an embrace as tight and fond as though they were long-lost sisters, as though they hadn't just seen each other half an hour before. Feeling as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders, Martha got to her feet, and then sank back down when the door opened again and disgorged Daniel Thornton. Helpless to escape, equally helpless to go and meet him halfway, she watched as he made his way across the hard-packed dirt of the street. Hands in his pockets, he moved at a casual pace that seemed almost like a swagger. A few feet away from her, he paused. She looked up at him and managed not to burst into tears. "Well," she said, "I don't suppose there's an inn or a boarding house in this town." Daniel Thornton scratched the back of his neck and shook his head. "Not much call for it," he said. "Don't tell me you didn't have a plan when you came here, young miss." "Martha." He went on as though she had not spoken. "Nobody comes to Fielder's Mill by accident." "I did have a plan," she said tightly. "It has not turned out as planned." He said nothing, but simply waited, eyebrows raised, until she continued of her own accord. "I had agreed to an engagement with a man here in town. It was set by a matrimonial agency, and I had no reason to expect that it would not be exactly as I thought." "That's so? Who?" She pressed her lips together. "You don't know him." "Ah, I know everybody." "Who?" Why was it so difficult to speak the man's name? It must be the knowing look Daniel Thornton was giving her. "Thomas Wheeler," she admitted at last. In a rush, she continued, "He claimed not to know that Lissa would be with me, and that he cannot provide for her. I suppose it might be true. I did not think the matrimonial agency would be duplicitous, but perhaps they were, in the end, in a rush to make the match and collect their fee. I certainly never pretended that I would be on my own. I'm all that Lissa has, her parents have both passed on. And she's all that I have, too. I'd sooner throw myself off a cliff than leave her behind." She had not realized how impassioned her tone had become until he lifted a hand, palm outwards. All right, he said. "No one's asking you to. I've got room for you both." She blinked at him. "I beg your pardon?" He jerked his head back towards the general store. "It ain't much. Just a room, and a small one at that. But I've got a feather bed, and there's a nice breeze through the window in the morning. Susie and I are just next door. You can get what you need from us, until you figure out what you want to do." He grew impatient with her continued silent stare and folded his arms. "Look, it's the only choice you've got. There ain't anywhere else to stay here in Fielder's Mill, and it ain't as though there's a stagecoach or a train, heaven help us, to hop on and return east. You're here for at least a week or two, until another wagon train comes through. You don't want to travel without trust me." "All right." Her voice was so faint that she hardly recognized it as her own. "I do." He frowned. "Do what?" "Trust you." It was true, too, though she wasn't sure how it had come about. He had been hardly anything but rude and obnoxious from the moment they had met, and yet she knew that he would not play her false or make a pretense of being anything other than what he was. He wouldn't even try to kiss her, like the cowboy had, and it was ridiculous that she should feel any sort of regret at the thought. He bent and picked up Lissa's trunk in one hand, then reached for hers with the other. She hopped off hastily and he took up the handle, then paused and glanced back at her. "Tom Wheeler?" She swallowed. Her throat was dry as a desert. "Yes." He shook his head. "You're better off, anyhow. Could have told you that." Martha wasn't sure whether she wanted to laugh or shriek. "Could you?" she said sharply. "Could you have told me any such thing? You don't know me, Daniel Thornton, nor do you know my circumstances. It was no business of yours to even have an opinion on what I choose to do with my life. It's entirely my right to decide who I marry, even if he is a louse. Look, young miss. Martha. Please." He stopped and met her gaze at last. There was a searching intensity in his dark eyes that made her heart turn over. "Martha," he said finally. "I've only known you a few days, Martha, and I reckon you're right. I reckon that means I can hardly claim to know you at all. I reckon no man ever really knows a woman, even should they be married for 50 years or more. But I've got a feelin' that whoever you are, whatever you're like, there's no way on God's green earth that Tom Wheeler would make you a fittin' husband. You're worth more than that, Martha Sinclair. He dropped his head, and she was grateful for it meant that he did not see the blush that rose across her cheeks. A dog'd be worth more, he added hastily, and now she had to fight against laughter. Of course he did not mean to pay her such a compliment. He thought little enough of her, that much was clear. It was only that he thought even less of Thomas Wheeler. Chapter 5. On the first morning after her arrival in Fielder's Mill, Martha had to pinch herself to be certain that she was not dreaming. The floor beneath her was not heaving with the movement of the cart wheels. There was no smell of cooking fires on the light breeze that filtered through the open window. Blessed silence was all she could hear, apart from Lissa's untroubled breathing. Gone were the noises of proximity with dozens of strangers. No shouts, no laughter, no gossip, no pots and pans banging heedless of any who were still clinging desperately to the remnants of their slumber. And praises be to the Lord above, there was a feather mattress. For that alone, she thought, she could have thrown her arms around Daniel Thornton and kissed him. Pretending that she felt no heat of a blush on her cheeks, she dragged herself from the comforts of the mattress and went to the wash basin in the corner. It was clear that the little quarters above the mercantile had not been used in some time. There was dust on the cracked mirror on the wall. But Daniel must have come in here, all in a hurry, to fix up the bed and put water in the pitcher before he had shown them upstairs the evening before. Her memories were rather fuzzy. Once the question of where they were to stay had been settled at last, exhaustion had set in. She denied it for so long, pushing through to make it to the end of the journey. Well, they were at journey's end now. For the moment, anyway. She pushed aside the worry about what they would do in the future. While Lissa still slept, she would allow herself a few brief moments to simply appreciate what she had right here and now, a window with a small chair in front of it, and a view of a town that was entirely new. The area in which Fielder's Mill was situated was entirely flat. Behind the buildings across the road, she caught glimpses of the sun, climbing over the edge of the horizon and stretching upwards as it prepared for its journey through the day. From the stairwell in the corner came the smell of coffee and the sound of someone whistling. She caught herself smiling. A few moments more, a wash, a new dress, and she stepped carefully down the narrow stairs to find Daniel Thornton perched on a stool behind the counter. The fire in the corner was lit, and a coffee pot was bubbling away. He glanced up at some slight sound that she made, and she was foolishly pleased to see his teasing smile. Rather dramatically, he clapped a hand to his forehead. What on earth? Who left a woman in the attic? She laughed, though she couldn't help but feel a bit self-conscious. It was a strangely intimate moment, just the two of them, and the store quiet around and dark around them. He seemed to feel the awkward pressure of the moment, too, and got up from his stool to retrieve a tin mug from the shelf behind him. He held it out to her. I reckon you wouldn't mind a bit of the bitter brew to wake you up. Oh, I'm awake. But she took the cup from him anyway with a nod of thanks and poured herself coffee from the pot. When she glanced up again, he was gone, disappearing into the hallway behind the counter without so much as a word of explanation. After a moment, she heard him whistling. Well, she told herself, he must be a very busy man. After all, he had the only mercantile for miles. She couldn't expect him to simply sit and shoot the breeze with her while she had her coffee. She took a sip and winced. It was very strong coffee, and very hot. Taking the cup with her, she wandered through the store. Some shelves, she noted, were nearly empty, while others were overfull. There was dust on everything, and boxes stood here and there waiting to be unloaded into their spaces on the shelving. She glanced back towards the counter. He was still out of sight, and the whistling had been replaced by a faint muttering that suggested a curse here and there. With a wry smile, she bent to open one of the boxes. A stack of boots looked back at her, boots in all sizes. After a moment of searching, she found the table that housed the rest of them. Setting her coffee cup to the side, she dug in with both hands. She was arranging the display according to size when she realized that he was back, standing behind the counter and watching her with arms folded. Blushing with embarrassment as though she'd been caught doing something untoward, she reached hastily for her coffee. He came towards her and walked around the table, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "That's not bad. A better layout than I've done before." The humility of this admission surprised her. But he'd said it himself, hadn't he? "When someone's right, I own it." "Thank you," she managed. "I suppose I shouldn't have been so presumptuous. I just thought." He waved her words away. "I'll take any help I can get. You can see for yourself that the store is in trouble. Half the shelves need to be restocked, but I can't get the products. And when things don't sell," he shook his head ruefully. "Well, that's the joy of owning a store in a town the size of Fielder's Mill. You never know what folks'll want." "I should say it needs more than restocking," Martha said. "It needs a good cleaning, too." "Sure does," Daniel agreed, with surprising equanimity. She hesitated, and then pushed a bit further. "Haven't you any help?" He shrugged. "Can't afford it. Hard enough to keep food on the table without paying a shop boy." She turned away from him, hoping he wouldn't see the desperation in her eyes. "I have a proposition for you, Daniel." He folded his arms and went quiet for a moment. She had half expected some teasing, almost flirtatious comment on her words, but instead, he seemed to withdraw into himself, tensing as though ready to ward off an attack. He said nothing, and she went on, feeling slightly lightheaded even as she spoke. "You said yourself it may be a few weeks before we are able to find another wagon train to go back east. And in truth, I don't know where we would go. We can't return to the town we came from, there's nothing for us there. In the meantime, you need help in the store, and Lissa and I need a roof over our heads and something to eat. Will you trade with me, Daniel? Your needs for ours?" Another long moment of silence. Had she overstepped somehow, said something she oughtn't? But her proposal only made sense. She had nothing to offer him apart from her willingness to work, and he had admitted that he needed the help. At last, he looked up and met her eyes. "I reckon there's no reason for me to turn you down," he said. "Seein' as it'll only be a temporary arrangement. But I'd better tell you now, Martha Sinclair, as honest and bald-faced as I can, that if you're lookin' to find someone else to fill the role that Tom Wheeler declined, you'd best look elsewhere. I've no intention of marrying Martha. Not you or anyone." He lifted his shoulders and settled them again, seeming to breathe easier now that the words were out. For her own part, she felt as though she had been slapped. Had she asked or even hinted at such a thing? No. It felt shameful to be told this, as though she were throwing herself at him, as though she'd set her cap for him from the moment they met, which could not be further from the truth. But after the initial rush of shame, bringing a hot flush to her cheeks, she reconsidered the motivation behind his words. He was an honest person, honest to the point of brashness and rudeness, as she had cause to know. More than likely, he simply wanted his intentions to be known, beyond question. It was kinder, in the end, to tell her at the very beginning of their relationship rather than risk the development of any attachment. An attachment which she had quite successfully avoided, despite his handsome face and oddly appealing habit of teasing. There was no reason why she should be disappointed. No reason at all. With an effort, she managed to keep her voice even and calm. "I've no intention of replacing Mr. Wheeler's claim on me. I hadn't wanted to marry in the first place, it was only a matter of convenience. No, not of convenience, of survival. But now that I have seen how men may treat women, I can say with an honest conscience that I will have no truck with such interactions ever again. I'd rather be an old maid than marry someone who treated me so carelessly." He nodded firmly. "That's right, Martha. Just as I said." He grinned. "You deserve better." Chapter 6. Lissa, of course, was delighted to hear that she need not leave her newfound best friend right away. Everything was perfect for the 9-year-old, a comfortable bed, plenty of food, wide open spaces in which to play, and a friend to play with. That evening at the supper table in the Thorntons' little house next to the mercantile, upon hearing that she and her cousin would remain in Fielder's Mill for at least a few weeks, she threw her arms up in the air and whooped aloud. Martha covered her mouth to hide her smile. Daniel was grinning at his plate, and Susan was laughing along with her younger friend. "Hoo-hoo," Susan caroled, emulating Lissa's exuberance. Martha felt her heart clutch with pride and love as she looked at the expression of joy on her young cousin's face. Lissa had had so little happiness in her life, did not she, also, deserve to have more? Well, Martha would do what she could about it. For the time being, they were at home. It took her by surprise, though, when Lissa leapt from her chair and scampered around the table to Daniel. He sat back in his chair, and the two eyed each other for a moment. Then, suddenly, Lissa grinned widely and leapt on him, throwing her arms around him in a bear hug. Daniel laughed aloud in his surprise, and was quickly overcome by his daughter, who was clearly determined not to be left out of this display of affection. Once again, Martha's heart seemed to first shrink and then grow within her, but it was different, this time. She couldn't quite put her finger on what emotion it caused, seeing Daniel's gruff delight at the embraces of the children, but that it caused some emotion, she could not deny. Perhaps it was better not to think about it too deeply. Every day of the next week and a half was full to the brim with work that needed to be done. There were boxes to be unpacked, dusting and cleaning to be tended to, and she even discovered a heretofore unexpected talent for balancing the ledgers that hosted Daniel's finances and credit accounts. Daniel, meanwhile, went about his business as usual, but she could sense his gratitude. It was visible in his occasional true smile, rather than the teasing grin, a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome into something transcendent. It did not happen often, for which she was grateful. It would have been impossible to stick to her tasks with that shine distracting her all the time. On the 10th day after her arrival, he greeted her in the morning with unexpected news. "I've got to unload that cargo, if I can. Robinson over in Hamilton was meant to buy it back, if it didn't sell, but he welshed on the deal. I'm going to strike out west to Pumley and New Britain. The mercantiles are smaller there, but there's a chance I can still turn something of a profit. And if those boxes just sit and mold in my storeroom, there's no chance of a profit at all." She stared at him. "New Britain and Pumley. Yes. How far away are they?" He shrugged. 30-40 miles. I'll be gone for a few days. But. She stopped abruptly, closing her mouth with an audible noise. He glanced back at her and grinned suddenly. "Nervous about watching the store?" "Well, yes. Of course. You'll do fine. If you have a question, just ask Susie." As he walked past her, he rested a hand on her shoulder, just briefly. The weight and warmth of it made her feel rather weak in the knees, or perhaps it was the prospect of running the mercantile while he was away. That, and keeping an eye on two rambunctious young girls. To her relief, however, once Susan realized that her father would be gone for a few days, she seemed to settle into a determination to be helpful. For the next few days, she stayed close around the store, putting shelves to rights. Lissa stayed close beside her, of course, and the two girls were more of a help than Martha would have expected, given their age and propensity for mischief. She found that she quite enjoyed working alongside the girls. Her affection for Susan was growing by the day. She had come to love the impish girl quite as much as Lissa herself. It was pleasant, as the day ended, to close the shop, take the girl's hands in her own, and walk across the yard to prepare supper in Daniel's cozy little kitchen. It seemed quite like a home. The only thing that was missing was Daniel himself. And she did, she had to admit, miss him. 3 days after his departure, a young woman with brilliant red hair came into the store. She gave Martha a smile in passing, but it was clear that she was looking for something that she didn't seem to be able to find, though she hunted through the aisles. At last, Martha ventured out from behind the counter. "May I help you?" "Oh. I don't think, well, perhaps." As a matter of fact, Daniel promised he'd set aside something special for me, and I had hoped to ask him about it. "Is he in the storeroom?" Martha shook her head. "He's out of town now, but I hope he will be back tonight or tomorrow." Perhaps if you tell me what it is you're looking for, I can find it for you. The red-headed woman eyed her for a moment, thoughtfully, and then shook her head. No, better just to leave it to Daniel. He'll know exactly where to look. But I haven't introduced myself. How terribly rude. She laughed cheerfully and stepped forward with a hand for Martha to shake. Prudence Langley. You can call me Prue. Martha Sinclair. I'm very pleased to meet you. Prue's hand was very soft. Martha had to reassess her initial judgment of her now that they stood closer. There were fine lines around the other woman's eyes that spoke of more years than she had thought, though they were artfully covered with powder. Prue Langley must be past 30, rather than the 20 or so Martha had guessed. There was a faint look of hardness and loss in her eyes that belied the friendliness of her tone. Now, what on earth is a young lady like you doing in a place like this, Martha Sinclair? Don't tell me you've sold yourself into slavery to our hard-hearted mercantile owner. She laughed. I hope you haven't aligned yourself with him irretrievably. Martha wasn't entirely certain what Prue meant by aligned, but she didn't care for the implication. She shook her head promptly. In fact, I'm only here for just a little while, until the next wagon train comes through, she said. She hesitated to say more, but what was the harm in being honest with this new acquaintance? Prue certainly seemed sympathetic. And even though Martha was only planning to stay in Fielder's Mill a short while, it would be better overall if she made more friends than just Daniel and Susan. I traveled west as a mail-order bride, but, well, the engagement has been ended. Prue Langley nodded eagerly, clearly working up to further questions, but Susan and Lissa came spilling back into the main room of the store at just that moment. Susan gave Prue nothing more than a dismissive glance. It was odd for a girl as friendly and bold as she, and Martha scolded her lightly. Now, Susan, you know your father would wish you to be polite to his customers. Susan looked as though she wanted to object to this, but Prue laughed gaily. She knows all too well just how her father would want her to act towards me. We're old friends, Daniel and I, though perhaps you could call it by some other name. Her tone was undeniably heavy with significance, and Martha fought the urge to step back away from her, so intensely did she object to the implication. But her new friend couldn't possibly mean what it sounded like. Daniel had made it clear that he was utterly uninterested in marriage. What, then, was their history? Her curiosity burned, but politeness restrained her tongue. Instead, she said, "This is Melissa. Say hello to Miss Langley, Lissa." Lissa, to her credit, did not follow in Susan's footsteps as she was wont to do, but gave the newcomer a wide smile and a curtsy along with her hello. Prue's own smile was warmer than ever as she greeted the girl in return. Susan snatched at Lissa's arm. "Come on," she muttered, and tugged her friend away, back in the direction they had come towards the storeroom. Martha turned a faintly embarrassed smile on Prue, but the other woman only shrugged. "Susie is a law unto herself," she said. "Daniel has done wonders with her, really, but it's no surprise that she should be so troubled and mistrustful, given how she was raised. I suppose your own little girl must have troubles, herself, not having a father?" For a moment, Martha was at a loss as to what Prue might mean. Then it hit her, and she shook her head even as she fought a blush. "Lissa is my cousin, my aunt's child. Her father passed away before she was born, and her mother just earlier this year, sadly." "Ah," said Prudence Langley, softly. "How very tragic." "Yes." Martha lowered her eyes. Unexpectedly, she found herself awash with emotion that she had thought long buried along with her aunt, regret over the sadness of Lissa's young life, and regret too over her own solitary path. Prue leaned forward, her tone low and urgent. "I hope, Martha, that you won't think me too forward or speaking out of turn, but given the circumstances, I feel I must warn you." She broke off suddenly at the sound of the bell above the door jangling wildly. Someone had entered the store, someone with broad shoulders and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Martha felt her stomach turn a somersault and glanced swiftly at Prue for her reaction to Daniel's sudden appearance. Prue Langley was starry-eyed, there was no other word for it. She was as captivated by the handsome man in front of them as Martha was herself. And she couldn't blame her for it, either. It was difficult for her to tear her eyes away from him, and there was no excuse for the way her heart lifted at the very sight of him. "Daniel. You're back. Hope you didn't give up on me that quick." His tone was gruff, the sarcasm within reminiscent of the first time they had met. It made her flinch away from him. It was not her favorite side of him. But his frown did not seem to be directed at her, but at the woman who stood beside her, smiling. "Everything all right?" "Just fine. It was like you said, Susan knew the answer to all my questions. I couldn't have gotten by without her." He responded to this praise with nothing more than a grunt. "You see how he ignores me," Prue told Martha in a loud whisper, clearly designed to reach Daniel's ears. "So very rude, considering how long we've known each other." Daniel pressed his lips together. "Hello, Prudence. Has Martha helped you to find whatever you're looking for?" Prudence smiled at him. "Oh, yes," she said. "Goodbye, then." He stalked past her, and Prue rolled her eyes expressively at Martha as she turned to go. "I'll see you around, my dear. It's a small town, impossible not to. Take care." "Thank you, Prue. It was a pleasure to meet you." She watched the other woman sail gracefully out the front door before she turned back to Daniel, a frown on her face. "What is this all about?" But Daniel would not look at her. He was behind the counter, already writing in the ledger. "Sold it all," he said, with satisfaction, and handed her a sack that jingled with coins. She opened it and caught her breath. There were bills in there, too, more money than she had seen in her entire life. His frank trust of her to hold it made her feel almost dizzy. "And at more of a profit than I'd have gotten from Robinson, even under the original agreement." He dotted a sentence with a flourish and a nod, then glanced back up at her. "You know where the safe is?" "Yes, of course." Still hardly daring to believe the amount she carried with her, she turned to head towards the storeroom. "Martha." When she glanced over her shoulder, he was still looking down at the ledger, though the book was closed. "I wouldn't get too friendly with Prudence Langley." She hesitated. "Why?" she asked at last. "For good reason." "That ought to be enough for you." Martha bit her lip, but his high-handed dismissal of her question irked her, and she could not simply let it pass. "It isn't," she said. "Perhaps you don't care for her, but I have no reason to dislike her, and I cannot simply dismiss her on your word." He looked up then, and she nearly took a step back at the intensity of his gaze. But she stood her ground, squaring her shoulders, and met his dark eyes with as much courage as she possessed. It took all she had. At last, he shrugged one shoulder and looked away. "Suit yourself," he said, and put the ledger where it belonged below the counter. She waited there, feeling frozen, as he left by the front door, calling for his daughter. How like Daniel to simply expect her to take his word for something and follow in his footsteps, the way that Lissa followed Susan, trailing her with eyes full of hero worship. Well, she was not a child, and she would not let any man dictate who she counted to be a friend. Even if she was dependent on him for her shelter and food. It wasn't until later that night, when she was trying in vain to fall asleep, that she realized that Prudence Langley had not asked after that special item Daniel had supposedly put aside for her, and even later when she decided that it must have been Daniel himself that she was in search of. But Daniel was put aside for only himself. That much was clear. Even more clear was the fact that, for whatever reason, he disliked Prue. Or perhaps for no reason at all. If she had set her cap for him, even flirted with him, he might simply bear her ill will because she threatened his solitary nature. But he must not always have been so solitary. Susan was proof of that. She sighed and rubbed her head, which had begun to ache. At her side, Lissa turned towards her sleepily and flung an arm around her neck. Martha closed her eyes and returned the embrace, suddenly and fiercely grateful for the unquestioning love of the little girl. If she had nothing else, she always had Lissa, and that would be enough for her. But it wasn't Lissa she was thinking of as she drifted off to sleep. Chapter 7. Dear Caroline, I was so very glad to hear that you all made it safely to Oregon. The Lord has surely blessed your family and will bless your new home as well. Lissa sends her love to the girls. She does miss them, of course. How adorable they all were, following her around and imitating her silly little ways, and how she loved to entertain them. I hope that they find fast friends there, too, and that Colin grows stronger with every day. Shortly before we left the wagon train, you likely recall, we were joined by a merchant and his daughter. As things have turned out, I am now employed as a shop boy, of sorts, as he would call it. Lissa and I have our quarters above the mercantile, and they are very comfortable. His daughter Susan has become a good friend to Lissa. The two of them make me laugh with all the mischief they manage to find, but they worry me, too, for I'm too busy to have my eye on them all the time. I cannot imagine how it must be for you, the mother of 4. How do you manage to cope? Of course, I'm no one's mother, only a cousin and guardian of one girl, and a friend, I suppose, of the other. But I can't help feeling a bit motherly towards them both. As for the merchant himself, Mr. Thornton, he has proven to be rather a complicated person. He can be moody and unpredictable, and yet so kind and warm at other times that I cannot keep my footing with him. And above all else, he loves his daughter more dearly than life itself, and one cannot help but like a man who so obviously dotes on his child as he does. I suppose I'll just have to make my mind up to accepting him as he is. But it's strange that he never married after whatever did happen to Susan's mother. He has not told me, and I confess I lack the courage to ask. Perhaps, someday, I'll find out, but I doubt it will be from the man himself. Please give my best wishes to all in the family and write when you have the chance to put pen to paper. Your friend, Martha Sinclair. May I take it to the post office? Lissa was so full of enthusiasm that she hopped from one foot to the other, hands clasped before her. May I please? Martha tried to keep from smiling, but it was difficult in the face of her cousin's eagerness for the simple task. Over the 3 weeks they had been in residence at Fielder's Mill, Lissa had received 2 letters, one from the oldest daughter of the Smith family, another from Jim Buford. The letter from the old soldier was, of course, directed to both of them, but he'd had the kindness to list Lissa first, and Lissa had promptly added the letter to her growing collection of missives. Martha did not begrudge her this in the slightest. She was grateful that the friendships they had cultivated along the journey with the wagon train had survived the trip and continued to thrive although they had been left behind. Very well, she said. Perhaps Susan will go with you. I don't mind, Susan said with a shrug that was almost alarmingly identical to the way her father performed the same action. I like old Peters. He's a fat old man and he makes me laugh. Martha frowned at her. Now, Susan, it isn't nice to speak that way about your elders and betters. Susan raised an eyebrow at her. Once again, the resemblance to her father took Martha aback. He may be my elder, but I reckon nobody would call him my better, she said rudely. Besides, why shouldn't I call him a fat old man? That's what he is, and what Pa calls him, and worse. Lissa giggled behind her hand. Fat old man, she whispered. It was difficult enough not to chastise Susan for her rudeness, which would have been unbecoming in an adult and was downright ugly in a child of 11. But the thought of the older girl's influence on innocent little Lissa seemed to seize Martha by the throat. Not another word from either of you, she said, taking the letter back from Lissa. I'll deliver it myself, if only to prevent that poor man from being hurt by your foolish teasing. Lissa looked shocked. Susan scowled. I'll go and talk to him if I want. Not in that fashion, you won't. You can't tell me what to do. Here, now, came the voice of Daniel from the storeroom. He emerged into the main room of the mercantile, shoving a pencil behind his ear, frowning almost as mightily as his daughter, though his tone was a mixture of irritation and teasing. How's a fellow supposed to take stock when all this hubbub is going on around him? I ought to have known better than to agree to have 3 women in the store at once, even if 2 of them are children. From now on you'll have to take turns. Martha, what's going on? I'm afraid that Susan has said some very impolite things about Mr. Peters at the post office, and Lissa appears to be following in her footsteps. Oh, is that so? He turned to his daughter. What did you say? Susan stuck out her tongue. I said that he's a fat old man. Daniel considered this for a moment and then nodded. And so, he is. What seems to be the problem? Susan laughed. Martha gaped at him. The problem? The problem is that it's unconscionable for a girl her age to speak so freely and rudely of anyone, let alone a harmless fellow like Mr. Peters. Daniel shrugged. He doesn't mind it. I reckon he's used to it. That's hardly the point. What is the point, Miss Sinclair? The rising tightness in his voice was a warning, but she could not back down now. I cannot allow Lissa to believe that such speech is acceptable. That's your lookout, isn't it? You're the one training her. Oh, yes, and who is training Susan? The silence in the store was so complete in the wake of her question that a pin could have fallen with a veritable crash. He stared at her for a moment, then glanced swiftly at his daughter. Go on, he said. Susan scurried out without hesitating, followed immediately by Lissa, who did not wait to be told. Left alone with Daniel Thornton, Martha could not help but wonder at her own temerity. But she had said nothing that she did not mean, and she could not take it back now. She met his gaze, though it cost her. I, said Daniel deliberately, am training my daughter. That's who. Martha took a deep breath. I understand. You, Miss Sinclair, are not her mother, and I'll thank you not to presume to act as though you are. The sharpness of his voice felt like a dagger. She winced and turned away from him as though it would protect her. I know I'm not, she said quietly. But perhaps a mother is what she needs. You don't know anything about her mother. Martha pressed on. She has so many good qualities, but can't you see that she must be guided if she is to grow up to be a woman that a father can be proud of? I'm proud of her just the way she is. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, struggling to control her breathing, to keep her voice from shaking. Susan is a wonderful child, she said at last, daring to meet his gaze once more. But she is still just a child. I've come to love her as though she were my own, but she's not. And she never will be. The harshness of the words, of the bald way in which they were spoken, cut across her protestations. She stared at him and was met with nothing but anger, tinged with disappointment. She could say nothing more. At a loss, she turned and left him there, practically fleeing out the front door, chased by her rampant emotions. She oughtn't to have said what she said. He was right, she knew nothing about Susan's mother, Daniel's wife. At least, she assumed that the unknown woman must have been his wife. She could not imagine upright, honest Daniel settling for anything else than a true and complete commitment. And what a commitment, though she had disappeared, he was true to her still. What had happened? Had she died suddenly? If he was still in love with her, it would explain his absolute rejection of the thought of marrying again. But his love for his daughter ought to have superseded any such thoughts. It was plain as day that Susan needed a mother. Even if Daniel could not marry for love, he could marry to give Susan what she needed. Her own words came back to her, echoic. Will you trade with me, Daniel? Your needs for ours? Her heart twisted within her, full of shame and disgust. She had promised him that she had no intentions of setting her cap for him. Had her strange attraction to him somehow manifested itself in her urge to mother Susan? And even if that were not the case, was that what Daniel now believed? His anger with her certainly seemed to suggest as much. But what would explain how broken-hearted his anger made her feel, except for the fact that she had fallen in love with him? The thought broke over her with the force of an ocean wave, and she gasped, one hand to her mouth. She had done exactly what she had promised herself and him, that she would not do. She had let her heart sally forth on its own, and it had tried to make a home with a man who wanted nothing to do with her. Somehow, blindly, she had found her way to the home of Prudence Langley. Over the past week, she'd met with the other woman a handful of times, even sharing coffee at the little dining hall that was Fielder's Mill's only such amenity. They had begun to forge a friendship, despite Daniel's clear disapproval of any such connection. And now, Martha found herself in front of Prue's home, in need of sympathy and a shoulder to cry on. The house itself had been inherited from Prue's father, as had her income. She was the last of her family in the Territories, as she had told Martha outright. The only other branch of the family were all back east, in Boston. But she'd been born and raised in Fielder's Mill, and was determined to stay there, even if it meant living forever on her own. Living alone to the end of her days was not her hope, of course, that much Martha was certain of. Prue's own attraction to Daniel Thornton was obvious, though both took care not to discuss it. It was just as obvious that Daniel had rejected her, though Prue Langley did not seem the type to take rejection lying down. Stubborn was one word for it, though Martha could think of other terms. But as complicated as her friendship with Prue was, the older woman seemed eager enough to offer the sympathy that Martha so desperately wanted. Once they were settled in the little sitting room, the entire story came spilling out: Martha's reason for becoming a mail-order bride, her rejection by Thomas Wheeler, her arrangement with Daniel. And then, despite her best efforts, the rest of it followed suit: her conflicting emotions, her sudden realization that the warmth and attraction she felt for him, along with the devastation caused by his anger, were nothing but the hallmarks and symptoms of love. In the wake of it all, Prue sat shaking her head. "Dear, dear, dear," she said softly. "What a mess you are in, poor Martha. I only wish I could have saved you from it, if I had spoken up a little sooner." Martha wiped away the tears that had come unbidden to her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I did try to tell you. That very first day, when he arrived so suddenly. I almost wonder whether he was not already there and listening. Perhaps he wanted to ensure that I could not tell you the truth. You see, Daniel Thornton is not what he appears to be." She leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "He has secrets that he has never told anyone, except for me. That's why he resents me so much, you see. He was soft on me, once, but a man with his changeable nature cannot maintain a love such as he once bore me, and you can see for yourself the result of a girl allowing herself to be drawn into his embrace." Martha stared at her. "I don't understand." Prue sighed. "I suppose not. It's only to be expected. He plays on our hearts as though they were fiddles. I suppose he told you that he would never marry." "Yes, he did. But he didn't tell you why." "No. And in telling you that it could never be, he simply stoked your interest without putting it to rest." She shook her head. "He's a very cruel man, for he knows that if he simply told the truth, there would be no cause for trouble. But it's the trouble that attracts him, I think. Having fallen victim to his machinations myself." Martha sat very straight and still. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, though her hands were trembling in her lap. Prudence Langley leaned even further forward. "He allowed himself to love and be loved once," she said. "By Susan's mother. His wife." Prue blinked at her. "Yes, I thought you did not know." Martha shook her head. "I supposed she had died, and it must have been very painful for him, and that's why he does not speak of it." "Oh, you poor innocent girl." Prue sighed. "The truth is, Daniel Thornton is still married, to this day, and no one has the faintest idea what has become of his wife." Chapter 8. The sound of Prudence's words rang in Martha's ears long after she left her friend's home. She wandered through the quiet streets of Fielder's Mill, seeking desperately for some peace of mind. "He's still married, you see, that's why he cannot marry another. But he's desperate for companionship. You can tell, can't you? By the way he teases, the way he flirts. I allowed myself to be drawn in, just for a time. It was weak of me, I suppose, but he's very persuasive. I ought to have known better. I knew his wife, you see. We grew up together, the two of us. Poor thing, she must have been as much a victim of Daniel's love as I was myself. No matter where she searched, she could not find what she so desperately wanted. No, but as the evening fell, she found herself once more standing in front of the mercantile, staring wild-eyed at the door. She could not bring herself to go in, she could not bear to confront Daniel, as she knew she must. But her little Lissa was in there, likely wondering what had happened to her cousin. The shelter and warmth and comfort of the attic room was there, waiting for her. She longed to sink into the featherbed, into the blessed peace of oblivion, to let her mind rest at last. Martha. Heart in her throat, she leapt around to see him standing behind her, hands shoved deep into his pockets. To his credit, he had the grace to look ashamed of himself, head lowered, that teasing twinkle in his eyes dimmed, but the look of shame on a man like Daniel Thornton was almost obscene. He was made to stand with his head high and proud. She could not manage to speak. After a moment, he went on. I owe you an apology. I spoke very roughly to you, and I shouldn't have done any such thing. You're right, and I know it. I knew it at the time you said it. Your words were only a reflection of something I've thought many a time myself. Perhaps that was why they irritated me so much. He half grinned. Not that it's much of a reason, much less an excuse. But there you have it. I know that Susie is unconscionably rude, especially for a girl her age. And I know it's my fault, that I ought to guard the way I speak when she is about. I'd be grateful, Martha, for your help in training her. Now, at last, she could manage the words that crowded her mouth. You lied to me, she said softly. He blinked at her. The smile disappeared. I did not. You did. You didn't tell me that you were still married. He broke off suddenly, running a hand through his dark hair. I didn't tell you I wasn't, either. It's true I didn't inform you about the existence of my wife. I didn't think it mattered. Warning you that I would not marry was enough, wasn't it? She shook her head, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears. Oh, I only wish it had been, Daniel. But it isn't, not nearly enough. I thought there was still a chance. It was foolish of me, I know that now, but I thought it all the same, deep within me where I hide all my dreams, and I let myself fall in love with you, little by little. She caught herself in a sob, and he reached out for her, eyes wide and almost frightened, but she pushed his hand away. It's my own fault, I admit that. But you ought to have told me the whole truth, all the same. He shook his head in disbelief. You can't be in love with me. His voice was hoarse. I won't allow it. She shrugged one shoulder up, gently. It isn't your decision, Daniel, and you didn't do what you might have done to prevent it. It's only today that I realized. I had half a mind to rush back here and tell you, and if I had, well, there's no way of telling what might have happened, I suppose, if Prue hadn't told me the truth. Prudence Langley. His voice rose in a shout, and she flinched backwards, though it was clear that his ire was not directed at her. I should have figured she was the one who would tell you this. She did. It was the action of a true friend. It was the action of a meddling hag. Prudence Langley is a liar through and through. What else did she tell you, He folded his arms and scowled down at her. She fought the urge to turn and run the other way. She told me, or, at least, she implied, that you and she had been romantically entangled, at one time. There was disgust and disbelief in equal measure in the scoff. He threw his hands in the air. I wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole, and she knows it. I suppose she conveniently left out the sordid details of what happened to my wife, and her own part in it. Well, if you want the truth, I'd be happy to oblige. Prudence Langley and Alice Hampton, my wife, were friends from childhood. Round about 15 years ago, when we were nearly grown, I asked to court Alice, and she agreed, and I've never seen a woman go so cold with rage and jealousy as Prudence, the day she found out. She'd set her cap for me, I knew it, but I never gave her the slightest bit of encouragement. There was a steel and a meanness in her soul that I recognized, and I wanted no part of it. I expected that her aim for me would pass. Marriage tends to cool amorous desires of the party left out in the cold. But I was wrong. Not 2 years after Susan was born, a fellow came through town, name of John Harold. He was a prospector, setting out west to California to make his fortune. He liked the look of Alice, and Alice didn't mind his either. His lip curled in disgust. She was bored, I guess, and poor Susan wasn't enough of a distraction. I never knew how shallow her soul was until well after we were wed. If I'd realized, but that's all water under the bridge now. A few weeks went by, and Harold left. Alice went with him. Martha drew in a quick breath, and he nodded. She felt as pinned by his gaze as a butterfly under a net. Wasn't until after that I found out Prudence Langley's hand in it. She encouraged it, arranged it, even. She told me details that she wouldn't have known. Slipped up, she thought she could step into Alice's shoes, and I'd hardly notice the difference. But I wasn't so far gone that I would let a viper into my bed simply not to be alone. Martha flinched again at this, and he noted it. His voice was softer when he spoke again. Maybe I oughtn't to tell you this. She shook her head. No, I asked you to. I wanted to know. And now, I do. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them together, yearning to reach out for him, to comfort them both. I'm so sorry, Daniel, so terribly sorry. You should never have been treated so awfully. No one deserved that, least of all you. They stood for a moment in silence, heads lowered. It occurred to her suddenly that the story had been spilled right there in front of the store, where anyone passing by could hear, but it was safer that way, she supposed. Had he told her the truth when they were alone, where no one could see, she might well have given in to her impulse to step forward and take him into her arms. And he might have let her. The thought made her tremble even more. It's impossible, she said finally. Daniel sighed. Yes. I can't stay here, Daniel. Not with the way I feel, knowing that I could never hope. His eyes met hers swiftly. Hope all you want, he said. That much is free. It's me you can't have, and my love I can't allow. But hope is something no one can demand from you. He sighed again, more heavily. As for whether you stay or you go, my own hope is that you will stay. Not for my sake, nor for yours. But for the sake of Susie and Lissa. They both have lost too much as it is. It would be a tragedy to part them so soon. She hesitated for a long moment and then nodded at last. Yes, you're right. It won't be easy, it would be the most difficult thing she'd ever done, she was certain of it, far more challenging than leaving behind Harkinson, Virginia, to travel west with a wagon train. More painful, too. But I'll stay. For Lissa and Susan. He nodded. Thank you, he whispered. She could not stand there any longer and trust her own strength. She turned and left him, seeking the comfort of her innocent cousin's unquestioning affection, and the quiet of the attic loft that had become her home. Chapter 9. Spring was well over, and midsummer had come to Fielder's Mill. Along with the long, hot days came twilights that were thinned out and glimmering as gossamer, and these times were Martha's favorite. After the store was closed for the day, she took to seating herself comfortably on the rocking chair out front, usually with a sheaf of papers and a pencil, to write letters. It had been a few months since she had last seen the travelers on the wagon train, and thus far she had received replies to her letters from almost all of them. There yet remained Vera and Alma to be heard from. Thinking of them one evening, she sent a swift prayer heavenwards that their uncle had turned out to be exactly who he had claimed to be, and that he'd been even wealthier than supposed, besides. Daniel had frankly marveled at the news that she was keeping in such close touch with those she'd met so briefly. But she had simply shrugged off his amazement. I have few enough people to care for in my life, she said. There's plenty of love and concern to go round. There was a look in his eyes at this statement that made her tremble a little. She'd been rather glad that he had walked away soon after that. It had proven to be just as difficult as she had thought, staying there with Daniel. She loved him a little bit more every day. Below his gruff exterior there was a heart of gold, warm and open and loving. It was hard not to picture how he might be, if he were free to love again. The easy, ready affection he showed for his daughter made it clear that he was not the sort of man to withhold love. If he was not still married, perhaps he would come to her and take her in his arms. There was no use thinking about it. He was still married, as far as any of them knew. What had possessed Alice Thornton to leave behind a man like that? Even more unforgivable was the fact that she had left behind a daughter. The only blessing was that Susan had evidently been too young to remember much about her mother, and Daniel had not told her that Alice had left willingly. That, he told Martha quietly, was a conversation for a far-off day, when Susan was older and not so easily hurt. Martha could not imagine a day when the girl would not be hurt by such a revelation. Perhaps Daniel would never tell her the entire truth. The one bright spot in all of this was the friendship between Lissa and Susan. Though Susan had her wild moments, it was clear that Daniel was putting forth the effort to calm them. When Martha chastised her for rudeness, the girl's reaction was more measured and respectful than it had ever been. All in all, she was shaping up to be a fine young woman. All she had needed was a little guidance. And Lissa, in her enthusiasm, was always a delight. It brought joy to Martha's heart to watch the two playing. They were more like sisters than simply friends. Yes, as difficult as it was, she had made the right decision, for the time being. What the future might hold, she could not know. But the future showed itself far more swiftly than she expected. It came about one evening as she wrote her letters on the veranda. A gentle cough alerted her, and she looked up to see Prudence Langley smiling at her. "Martha. My dear girl, it's been ages since I've seen you. Don't tell me that wicked Daniel has been keeping you so busy that you cannot venture forth to see your friends." Martha stood, her hand clutching at her throat involuntarily. In truth, she had done her best to avoid the older woman, but her best had not been good enough, it seemed. There was nothing for it but to tell her the truth, holding nothing back. "Daniel has done no such thing," she said, striving to keep her voice calm. "As I suspect you well know. But you haven't come to see me. After our last chat, I thought surely you would at least pay me a visit before you left," she trailed off, squinting at Martha. "At least, I assume you to be leaving. Surely you can't continue to stay with a man who treats you so poorly." Martha lifted her chin. "Daniel hasn't treated me poorly at all. Perhaps things are more complicated than either of us would wish, but he is a good man. He explained it all to me. The whole story, and that is why I cannot keep company with you, Miss Langley, knowing what I now know." Prudence Langley stared at Martha for a long moment, weighing her in the balance. At last, the suspicious glare disappeared, changing gradually into a rather wry and knowing smile that Martha did not care for. "Oh, he's told you the whole story, has he? Every sordid detail?" "Yes. And yet you still defend him." She sighed. How tragic, to see a young mind and heart so corrupted by the vagaries of love. "I suppose he's implied to you that he loves you in return, but cannot say so outright." "Oh, no, it would be wrong, morally wrong." Martha flinched. "But you ought to know moral degradation when you see it, I suppose," Prudence said musingly. "What do you mean?" Martha demanded stiffly. "Why, your poor little Lissa. Everyone knows that she isn't really your cousin, as you claim. Everyone knows that she's the result of, well, shall we say a youthful indiscretion? And of course you aren't as young as you claim. It's all a part of the ruse." Martha stared at her, unable to believe what she was hearing. "How you can stand there and claim such a bald-faced lie, you could never prove such a thing." "But it needn't be proven," Prue said sweetly. "It need only be implied. Especially, perhaps, to our dear Daniel. He might look at you a little differently, don't you think, if he believes that you are lying about poor little Lissa? Refusing to take responsibility for what was, ultimately, your own mistake." She shook her head and sked. In the wake of his disappointment with Alice, that might just break his heart. He'd give up on women forever. "I'd hate to cause such a thing, Martha. Wouldn't it be better if you simply take Lissa and leave before the news reaches his ears?" Martha was caught halfway between simply staring wordlessly and stepping forward to slap the other woman across the face. Never had she been so injured, so furious. To think that someone who had made overtures of friendship would turn on her in this manner, the only thing that kept her from movement was the lingering disbelief that this was really happening. Daniel, fortunately, had no such qualms. "Prudence Langley," his voice boomed out from behind them. "You'll leave my property and never come back." Prue's face went white beneath the powder. She turned, half stepping back, but Daniel was already upon them. He stood close to Martha, a protecting angel, and an avenging one, should the need arise. Prudence's wide eyes made her fear plain, but there was still cunning in those eyes, too. She glanced towards Martha, then back at Daniel. Slowly, she smiled. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered. "You're so ready to believe the worst about everyone, except for those who take you under their spell. You'd have been better off if you had accepted my proposal, years ago, but I'm afraid I don't want you anymore. That's all right with you, isn't it?" It was a lie. Martha knew it was a lie. It was nothing but a ploy. Daniel tensed to step forward, and without thinking she reached out to take his arm. His muscles were rock-hard under her touch, but he did not look back at her. Prudence was smiling more widely. "You care for her, then," she said. "The more fool you. Even if you don't believe me about poor little Lissa, you'll never know the truth." "I do know the truth," Daniel gritted out. "It's just as Martha has said. She's never lied to me, not like you, Prudence Langley." "Oh, of course." Prue nodded with a show of sympathy. "Martha is perfect. It's too bad that her engagement did not work out, isn't it? Of course, once she arrived, she simply saw someone that she preferred, but she isn't to be blamed for that, is she? I don't suppose you've investigated her story or discussed it with poor Tom Wheeler. He's told me at length how she broke his heart, but that's neither here nor there. You love her, Daniel, that much is clear. So why don't you marry her?" She opened her mouth, making a show of hesitation, then remembrance, and snapped her fingers. "Oh, that's right, you're still married to poor Alice. Alice, whom you drove into the arms of another man." It was all Martha could bear. There was no way to answer the flood of vileness from Prudence Langley, no way to make it stop short of slapping her across the face. It was tempting, but Martha Sinclair had not come this far by disregarding the virtue of self-control. Instead, she stepped forward and gave Prudence a light shove, just enough to push her off the veranda. As the villainess was stumbling backwards and striving to regain her footing, she snatched Daniel by the arm and hauled him bodily into the store, slamming the door and shooting the lock home. For a long moment they stared at each other, panting. Her heart broke a little to realize that Prudence had been telling the truth about one thing. From the look in his eyes, Daniel Thornton did love her, after all. "I must leave," she whispered. "I can't stay any longer. There's no telling what she might do, in this state. She's so furious." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I don't want you to. But you can't stop me, Daniel. You know it's the only thing left for me to do. I must protect Lissa, and you and Susan, and myself. She won't stop as long as I'm here. She wants you for herself, and she'll drive anyone you love away." Somehow, he reached out, and she found herself in his arms, his face pressed to her hair. She whispered into his shoulder. "There's another wagon train coming, heading west. I'll take it, I don't care where I go. It will be here in 2 days' time. Lissa and I. Don't say it. We'll leave then, Daniel." He pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, and she knew that she was inches, seconds away from his kiss. It took all the strength she had to wrench herself from her arms and flee, and she did not stop until she was safely in the attic, with the door shut and locked, and then she sat in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees and trembled and mourned and cried. Chapter 10. "Martha. May we go to the post office?" Martha looked up from the ledgers, her eyes rather dull. It was hard to put her concentration on anything today. The memory of the evening before was still so very vivid in her mind. It took a moment for her to realize that the two young creatures in front of her were Lissa and Susan, dancing back and forth in their eagerness. "The post office?" "To see whether there are any letters for me," Lissa said promptly. "To add to my collection." "It's been a week since I've asked, Martha, please say I might." It was on the tip of her tongue to deny the request, not from any meanness of spirit, but from fear. Suppose Prue had already begun her campaign of gossip. Should the rumors reach Lissa's ears, they might well break her heart. But another thought forestalled her impulse. The wagon train would arrive the very next day, and she and Lissa would be gone forever. Any letters that came for the eager-eyed girl would be lost. She took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "But be swift about it, mind, and come straight back here when you're done." She returned her eyes to the ledger, but not her attention. Her mind was wandering off into the distance, distraught with the fear of the future and the certainty of loss. She knew now that Daniel loved her, but there was nothing to be done about it. He was still married, still beholden to his wife, wherever she might be. If she ever returned, he would take her back, installing her under the roof of that cozy little house that she had started to think of as home. The thought turned her stomach, and yet it was the right thing to do, the moral thing. Curse morality, she thought sourly, and curse Alice Thornton. But the very next thought was of contrition. It was wrong of her, of course, to feel that way. Daniel Thornton was a married man. The only trouble was simply that he was married to someone other than she. With a sigh, she tried her best to put her mind on the books in front of her. She was still worrying over the accounts when the girls returned, bursting with enthusiasm. "Martha, Martha. 2 letters. One for me and one for you." She looked up with a vague smile plastered on her face. Of course it was pleasant to get mail, but the last thing she needed just then was another rhapsodic missive from Caroline Smith detailing how everything was turning out perfectly in Oregon. To her surprise, though, the hand that had addressed the envelope Lissa gave to her was not a familiar one. She frowned at it thoughtfully for a moment before opening it. Lissa had beat her to the punch. She gave a cry of delight. "It's from Vera and Alma. They're safe in California." A small smile crossed Martha's face despite herself. Vera and Alma were the last friends that they'd made on the journey west from whom they had not yet heard. It was good to know that they were safely at their destination. Happiness, she hoped, was not far behind. "Dear Miss Martha. How pleased we were to receive your letter. And how kind of you to think of us. But then you are one of the kindest people we have ever met, of course, so it is in your nature to do such a thing. Before we carry on, let us put your mind at ease. Yes, we have arrived safely in Sacramento, California, and our uncle is exactly who he claimed to be. And his fortune appears to be even more than we anticipated." Martha smiled to herself as she read on. The most important questions were answered in that simple paragraph, everything else was simply detail. And plenty of detail there was, as the 2 sisters outlined everything there was to know about their new home, their aging and wealthy uncle, and the lives they had discovered for themselves. It wasn't until near the end of the letter that she read something that made her sit up and slow down. "We must tell you, of course, about a very interesting man that we met shortly after our arrival. Our Uncle Milton knows him well, for he's also a prospector, though not as successful as our uncle. He is very fortunate. He struck our attention because he spent some time in Fielder's Mill, which we remembered as the town in which you now reside. He was never a resident there, only passing through. Likely no one will remember him, but it's funny what a small world it is at times, is it not? His name is John Harold, and he is a widower. His wife died a few years ago, and he has never married since. Of course, one or the other of us hope to comfort him in his bereavement. He's very handsome and extremely charming." Martha caught her breath. Her eyes seemed fixed on the name, unable to move on from the paragraph. John Harold. But surely that was. Not 2 years after Susan was born, a fellow came through town, name of John Harold. He was a prospector, setting out west to California to make his fortune. Daniel's recounting of the story echoed through her memory. Could it possibly be? But if it was, did she have the right, based solely on her own selfishness, to tell him the truth? Might it not do more harm than good to Daniel and Susan both to realize that their wife and mother had passed away, that she had married another, quite without any sort of legal divorce, and claimed to be what she was not until the day she was dead and buried? Out there somewhere in California there must be a tombstone that read Alice Harold, and it was a lie. What would it do to Daniel to know the truth? What would it do to Susan, to know that her mother was dead? Martha. The sound of her own name, spoken in that familiar baritone with a softness that made her heart clench, was her undoing. She looked up with tears in her eyes, and he knew that something had happened. What is it? The question was soft. His eyes were softer. She handed him the letter and pointed, with a trembling hand, to the paragraph at the end. He read it through, took a deep breath and looked up at her. The intensity of his gaze made the rest of the world shrink away from her, and it was only Daniel and herself, at the end of the journey, with nothing but each other. Nothing mattered but the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his arms, and she went into them willingly. But even now, he was restrained. Even now, his kiss, though fervent, was tinged with uncertainty. She took her face away from his and wrapped her arms around his neck, buried her face in his shoulder. Daniel. Do you know what this means? I have an idea. He was trembling. In all her life, she would never have imagined that a man as strong as Daniel Thornton would show such emotion. But he was honest, as he had always told her, honest in his weakness, just as he was honest in his strength. He took a deep breath. We can't be sure. Not just on the strength of this. It's something, but it isn't enough, not quite. But we can find out, she told him, told herself, eyes closed, whispering. The girls had gone off to play and there was no one to hear, no one there but the two of them, but she couldn't speak aloud all the same. It was too sacred, this precious chance that they might be together after all. If she spoke too loudly, the spell would be broken, the miracle of possibility undone. I'll write a letter, I'll ask. Not enough. He shook his head. No. Better I go in person. To forestall any rumors. To be sure. He drew back, just a little, just enough to look down at her. There was such love and longing in his eyes that she felt her resolve weakening. Who cared whether he was still married? Who cared whether Alice was alive? I do. I do, because he does. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead and spoke as he would have done to Susan. It will take some time. I'll join that wagon train tomorrow, the one that's headed west. Will you wait for me, Martha? Will you wait for me here in Fielder's Mill? She thought of the wagon train, headed west from her old home in Virginia. The way she had felt back then, awash with uncertainty and hope. She had grown to love those days of travel, long and exhausting as they were. She had made friends, and those friendships had brought her the keenest, finest happiness that she had ever known. It would be different this time. She would know what the future holds. Faith was all-encompassing. She would travel alongside the man she loved, and perhaps they would even be married in California. She bit her lip, smiled, shook her head. No, I won't wait, she whispered. He had scarcely enough time to furrow his brow in confusion before she went on, leaning up to whisper the words onto his lips. I'll pack our things. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.